Road Warrior Hawk was the chaotic half of the greatest tag team in history, a man who turned pure intimidation into a global brand. He could silence a riot with a single glare and sell out stadiums just by walking through the curtain. But the monster who looked invincible on camera was actually a fragile soul, slowly disintegrating in the locker room. He survived steel cages, car wrecks, and the brutal Japanese strong style, only to be broken by a wooden puppet and a script about his own suicide. How does a man spend a lifetime building a suit of armor, only to die the moment he finally takes it off? Michael Hegstrand entered the world on January 26, 1957, in St. Paul, Minnesota. He was born into the heart of the American Midwest during a time of rigid social expectations. St. Paul was a blue-collar city, defined by its winters and its work ethic. It was a place where fathers worked in mills or factories, and sons were expected to be strong, silent, and stoic. Hegstrand was not born a giant. In his early years, he was remarkably average, a detail that haunted him. He grew up in a standard middle-class environment, but he harbored a deep-seated feeling of inadequacy. While other boys were naturally athletic or effortlessly confident, Mike felt small. He felt invisible. In the rough-and-tumble hierarchy of the St. Paul schoolyards, visibility was survival. If you weren't the loudest or the toughest, you were a target. By the time he reached adolescence in the early 1970s, this insecurity began to manifest as an obsession. He didn't want to just play sports, he wanted to change his physical reality. He discovered weightlifting. In 1972, gym culture was not mainstream. There were no neon-lit fitness centers on every corner. To be a bodybuilder was to be an outlier. It meant seeking out dark, dusty dungeons filled with rusty iron plates and the smell of stale sweat. For a teenage Hegstrand, the gym became a sanctuary. The iron was predictable. If you exerted force, the weight moved. If you ate enough and lifted heavy enough, your body changed. It was the one area of his life where he had total control. He began to pack on mass at an alarming rate. He wasn't training for health, he was training for armor. He wanted to be so big that no one would ever look past him again. He wanted to be so big that he would never have to feel afraid. This period of his life was defined by a singular focus. He sacrificed social events to train. He ate massive amounts of food, cheap calories to fuel the growth. By the time he graduated high school, the small boy was gone. In his place was a hulking young man, thick-necked and broad-shouldered, walking with a swagger that masked the fact that inside, he was still the same scared kid from St. Paul. After high school, Hegstrand found the only job that paid him for his size: bouncing. He found employment at a notorious establishment called Grandma B's. This was not a polite cocktail lounge. It was a rough, high-volume bar in the Twin Cities that attracted a dangerous mix of bikers, tough guys, and heavy drinkers. Grandma B's was Hegstrand's university of human behavior. Working the door, he learned the psychology of intimidation. He realized quickly that actual fighting was inefficient and dangerous. The true skill lay in projecting an aura of violence so palpable that the other guy backed down before a punch was thrown. Hegstrand mastered the crazy eyes. He learned that if he stood perfectly still, stared unblinkingly at a troublemaker, and lowered his voice to a rasp, it was more terrifying than shouting. It was in this nocturnal world that he forged the relationships that would define his life. The bouncers of Minneapolis were a fraternity of giants. Among them were men like Richard Rude, Barry Darsow, and a quiet, massive kid named Joe Laurinaitis. The dynamic between Hegstrand and Laurinaitis was established right there at the door of Grandma B's. Laurinaitis was the anchor, calm, impossibly strong, a steady presence. Hegstrand was the live wire. He was the one cracking jokes, starting trouble just to stop it, and bringing a chaotic energy to the shift. They were a perfect counterbalance. They bonded over the monotony of the job, the late-night trips to 24-hour diners to consume thousands of calories, and the shared feeling that they were destined for something bigger than throwing drunks out onto the snowy streets of Minneapolis. But life as a bouncer has a ceiling. By 1980, Hegstrand was drifting. He was in his early 20s, possessing a world-class physique and a terrifying presence. But he had no direction. He was a local tough guy, a king of a very small hill. He needed a way out. The lifeline came in the form of Eddie Sharkey. Sharkey was a former wrestler turned bartender, a man with a cynical view of the world and a sharp eye for talent. He watched Hegstrand, Laurinaitis, Rude, and Darsow work in the doors and saw dollar signs. He saw a group of guys who were bigger and more charismatic than half the roster of the American Wrestling Association. Sharkey approached them with a simple pitch. "I can teach you to wrestle." Hegstrand jumped at the chance. Wrestling seemed like the logical evolution of his life. It was a place where his size was an asset, where his aggression was celebrated, and where the performance he put on every night as a bouncer could make him rich. The training began in late 1981, and it was brutal. Sharkey didn't believe in soft landings. The school was often a basement with low ceilings or an unheated garage. The ring was stiff, sometimes just a thin layer of padding over plywood, or in some cases, mats on concrete. Hegstrand had to learn to bump. This is the fundamental trauma of professional wrestling. He had to learn to throw his 260-pound body into the air, rotate, and land flat on his back, dispersing the impact. The first time he did it, it knocked the wind out of him. The 10th time, his vision blurred. By the 100th time, his body was a map of bruises. This period revealed Hegstrand's resilience. He wasn't a natural athlete in the way Rick Rude was. Rude took to the technical aspects of wrestling like a fish to water. Hegstrand was stiffer, less fluid, but he had fire. When he hit the ropes, the whole ring shook. When he grabbed someone in a headlock, he squeezed until their eyes watered. He worked snug, wrestling parlance for hitting hard. Sharkey recognized that Hegstrand's greatest asset wasn't his wrestling ability, it was his mouth. In the promo classes where they practiced interviews, Hegstrand came alive. He channeled the manic energy of the heavy metal music he loved. He spoke in rapid-fire bursts, his voice gravelly and intense. While other trainees stumbled over their words, Hegstrand could talk for 5 minutes without breathing, eyes bulging, veins popping. He wasn't acting. He was simply letting the internal pressure of his life escape. By 1982, Sharkey deemed them ready for the road. Hegstrand's debut was not glamorous. He was sent to Vancouver to work for Al Tomko's All-Star Wrestling, a low-budget territory far removed from the bright lights of New York or Minneapolis. He was given the name Crusher Von Haig. It was a lazy, derivative gimmick. Promoters looked at his blonde hair and his size and defaulted to the evil German trope that had been stale since the 1950s. He was told to goose-step, to sneer, and to act like a foreign menace. Hegstrand hated it. It felt like a costume party. He was an American kid who loved Black Sabbath and lifting weights, not a Nazi caricature. The gimmick suffocated his natural charisma. In the ring, he was green and awkward. He struggled to lead matches. The crowds in Vancouver were small and indifferent. This was Hegstrand's first taste of the darkness of the wrestling business. The pay was abysmal, sometimes barely enough to cover gas and food. He slept in cheap motels or in his car. The loneliness was crushing. Separated from his friends and his support system, the silence of the road began to eat at him. It was during these long, lonely drives through the Pacific Northwest that the seeds of his future substance abuse were watered. He drank to kill the boredom. He took pills to kill the pain of the bumps. He was learning the lifestyle before he had even earned the success. He returned to Minneapolis later that year, disillusioned. He had the size, he had the training, but he was failing. He was just another big guy in a business full of them. He needed a spark. He needed an identity. The turning point of Michael Hegstrand's life happened via a telephone call from Ole Anderson. Anderson was the booker for Georgia Championship Wrestling, a territory that was exploding in popularity thanks to its slot on TBS, the Superstation. Anderson had seen tapes of the Minnesota boys. He wasn't interested in their technical skills. He wanted monsters. He had a vision for a new kind of tag team, two massive, uncontrollable powerhouses who would destroy the traditional rules of wrestling. He didn't want Crusher Von Haig. He wanted Mike Hegstrand, and he wanted him paired with Joe Laurinaitis. Hegstrand packed his bags for Atlanta. This was the big leagues. But when he arrived, he and Joe were still just two guys in gym shorts. They needed a look that matched the violence Anderson wanted them to portray. The inspiration came from the cinema. Mad Max 2. The Road Warrior had recently been released in the United States. The imagery of the film, the leather, the spikes, the mohawks, the lawless brutality, struck a chord with Hegstrand. It was visceral. It was punk rock. It was everything traditional wrestling was not. Hegstrand and Laurinaitis went to a quirky shop in downtown Atlanta. They bought leather chaps. They bought studded dog collars. But Hegstrand knew that wasn't enough. They needed to alter their physical being. In a bathroom in Atlanta, Michael Hegstrand took a razor to his head. He shaved the sides completely bald, leaving a thick strip of hair down the center, the reverse mohawk. In 1983, in the conservative South, this was an act of social suicide. Walking down the street, people crossed to the other side. Mothers pulled their children away. He looked in the mirror and didn't see Mike from St. Paul anymore. He saw something alien, but he wanted more. He began to experiment with face paint. He didn't want the intricate designs of kabuki. He wanted war paint. He drew sharp, jagged lines in red and black. He accentuated his eyes to make them look manic. He drew lines from his mouth to simulate a perpetual snarl. When he stepped back and looked at Joe, who had also shaved his head and donned the paint, the transformation was terrifyingly complete. They were no longer Mike and Joe. They were Hawk and Animal. The Road Warriors were born. Their debut on Georgia television was a moment of cultural impact that is hard to overstate. In 1983, tag team wrestling was a dance. It was about work in the arm, quick tags, and scientific holds. Hawk and Animal didn't dance. They mauled. They walked to the ring to the pounding drums of Black Sabbath's Iron Man. They didn't smile. They didn't shake hands. When the bell rang, they sprinted across the ring and decapitated their opponents with clotheslines. They didn't sell. If an opponent punched Hawk, he would just stare at them, shake his head, and scream. The effect on the audience was primal. Fans were used to seeing wrestling as a performance. The Road Warriors made it look like a mugging. They were stiff. They hurt people. They threw opponents out of the ring onto the concrete floor without breaking stride. For Hegstrand, this was the ultimate drug. The moment he walked through the curtain and heard the gasp of the crowd, the insecurity vanished. As Hawk, he was invincible. He could say anything, do anything, hurt anyone. The rush of adrenaline was unlike anything he had felt in the gym or at the bar. He began to develop his promo style. Paul Ellering, their manager, would hold the microphone, and Hawk would lean in, his voice dropping to a guttural growl before exploding into a scream. "We snack on danger and dine on death." It was over the top. It was ridiculous. And it was magnetic. But even in these early months of success, the lines were blurring. To maintain the intensity of Hawk, Hegstrand had to stay at a level of high-octane aggression, 24 hours a day. He couldn't just turn it off when he went back to the hotel. The steroids he used to maintain his 275-pound frame made him irritable and aggressive. The cocaine he began to use to keep his energy up for the shows made him paranoid. He was 26 years old. He was the most terrifying man on television. He was making more money than his father ever dreamed of. And he was standing on the edge of a cliff looking down, convinced he could fly. By the summer of 1983, the landscape of professional wrestling in Georgia had ceased to be a sport. It had become a slaughterhouse. When Michael Hegstrand, now fully consumed by the persona of Hawk, stepped through the curtain alongside Animal, the air in the arena changed. You could feel the shift in barometric pressure. In the decades prior, tag team wrestling was built on a rhythm. The heroes would get shined up, the villains would cheat to take control, the heroes would suffer, and finally, the hot tag would lead to a comeback. It was a formula. It was safe. It was predictable. The Road Warriors took that formula, doused it in gasoline, and dropped a match. They didn't sell for anyone. They didn't cheat in the traditional sense. They didn't need to hide brass knuckles in their trunks because they were the weapon. Hawk would storm the ring, his face a rictus of insanity, and simply run through human beings. The matches were short, sometimes 30 seconds, sometimes a minute. They were squash matches, but they were different. Usually a squash match was a breather. When Hawk and Animal did it, it was an execution. For Hegstrand, this power was intoxicating. Inside the ring, the insecurity that had plagued his youth evaporated. When he clotheslined an opponent, he didn't just extend his arm, he tried to take their head off. The stiffness of the Road Warriors became their calling card. In the locker room, the jobbers, the enhancement talent paid to lose, were terrified. Seeing their names next to the Road Warriors on the booking sheet was a sentence to physical trauma. There is a specific cruelty to the wrestling business of the 1980s. It was a shark tank. If you were soft, you were eaten. Hegstrand and Laurinaitis were young, green, and getting the biggest push in the territory. The veterans hated them. They saw two steroid-pumped bodybuilders with dangerous haircuts making more money than men who had been taking bumps for 20 years. They called them unsafe. They called them reckless. And they were right. Hegstrand was dangerous. Not out of malice, but out of intensity. He was driving a Ferrari with no brakes. During one televised taping, Hawk pressed a wrestler above his head and threw him out of the ring, not onto the apron, not onto a mat. He threw him onto the concrete floor. The sound of the body hitting the cement was sickening. The crowd didn't cheer, they gasped. It was the sound of reality intruding on the show. Paul Ellering, their manager, was the only thing keeping the train on the tracks. On camera, he was the sinister mastermind, directing the violence. Off camera, he was the babysitter. He managed the money, the travel, and the tempers. He saw that Hegstrand was a different animal than Laurinaitis. Animal would finish a match, shower, and think about the gym or his girlfriend. Hawk would finish a match vibrating with adrenaline and look for the nearest exit to the nightlife. The rush didn't end when the bell rang. It wasn't just the violence, it was the aesthetic. In late 1983, they added the final piece of the armor, the spikes. They took football shoulder pads and modified them. They drilled holes and inserted massive stainless steel spikes. They looked like medieval torture devices. When the lights hit the chrome, they gleamed. This wasn't a costume, it was a barrier. No one could touch them. Hegstrand used the spikes as a psychological weapon. In interviews, he would loom into the camera, the spikes framing his painted face, and deliver promos that were less about winning matches and more about inflicting pain. He didn't speak in the cadence of a wrestler. He spoke in the cadence of a lunatic. "We don't wrestle," he would scream. his voice shredding his vocal cords. We survive. This was the key to his connection with the audience. In the Reagan era of American excess, Hawk was the ultimate ED. He was the part of every blue-collar worker who wanted to scream at their boss and flip over a desk. He was pure, unfiltered rage. The fans, who were supposed to boo the bad guys, couldn't help themselves. They cheered. They started wearing homemade face paint. They chanted Road Warriors. The promoters in Georgia and soon the AWU in Minnesota had a problem. They had created villains who were too cool to hate. They had inadvertently birthed the cool heel. In 1984, the Road Warriors moved to the American Wrestling Association, based in Minneapolis. For Hegstrand, this was a homecoming. He was returning to the city where he had been a bouncer, but now he was a god. The AWA was run by Verna Gein, a staunch traditionalist who believed wrestling should look like legitimate amateur grappling. He hated the Road Warriors' style. He hated the paint. He hated the no-selling. But he loved the money. And Hawk and Animal were printing money. They feuded with the Crusher and Baron von Raschke, legendary figures in Minnesota. But the dynamic was off. The fans didn't want to see the old guard win. They wanted to see the Road Warriors destroy. However, being home was a double-edged sword for Hegstrand. Minneapolis was where his old demons lived. It was where his old drinking buddies were. The Road Warrior lifestyle began to accelerate. The steroid cycles became heavier to maintain the freakish size. The painkillers Vicodin, Percocet, Soma became a necessary part of the breakfast routine to numb the agony of the ring. And the nights were long. Hegstrand was the life of the party. He was generous, loud, and wild. He bought rounds for the bar. He was the center of attention. But those close to him began to notice darkness. The Animal would go back to the hotel room to sleep. Hawk would stay out until sunrise. He wasn't just drinking for fun, he was drinking to silence the noise in his head. The character of Hawk was fearless, but Mike Hegstrand was still anxious. He worried about his spot. He worried about losing his size. He worried that if he stopped being Hawk for even a second, the world would see the fraud underneath. So he never stopped being Hawk. He wore Zubaz pants everywhere. He kept the haircut. He lived the gimmick 24/7. The AWA couldn't hold them. They were too big. In 1986, they signed with Jim Crockett Promotions, the flagship territory of the National Wrestling Alliance. This was the major leagues of Southern wrestling. It was the home of Ric Flair, Dusty Rhodes, and the Four Horsemen. This transition marked the peak of their career. They were thrust into a locker room filled with the absolute best workers in the world. And the culture clash was immediate. The NWA was a work rate territory. The wrestlers there prided themselves on their ability to go 60 minutes, to tell complex stories, to bump and feed. The Road Warriors walked in and refused to do any of that. There is a famous story involving the Midnight Express, a technically brilliant team managed by Jim Cornette. The Midnight Express were experts at making their opponents look good. The Road Warriors were experts at making their opponents look dead. When they wrestled, it was a clash of philosophies. Hegstrand, specifically, clashed with the establishment. The Four Horsemen, Ric Flair, Arn Anderson, Tully Blanchard, Ole Anderson, represented the champagne-sipping, suit-wearing elite. Hawk represented the gutter. The feud wrote itself. During the Great American Bash Tour of 1986, the Road Warriors were arguably the most popular athletes in the country. They were drawing massive houses in stadiums. They were the main event, even without the world title. The pressure was mounting. The schedule was inhuman. JCP ran shows almost every night, sometimes 2 on weekends. They were driving hundreds of miles a day. The car was a pharmacy on wheels. To wake up, caffeine and ephedrine. To work out, testosterone and decadurabolin. to wrestle, adrenaline, to come down, alcohol, somas, halcyon, to sleep, whatever was left. Hegstrand's tolerance was becoming legendary. He could consume amounts of intoxicants that would hospitalize a normal man and still show up to the arena, paint his face, and perform. But the performance was starting to fray at the edges. His temper was shorter. His patience with the fans, with the promoters, and even with Animal was thinning. The zenith of this era came at Starrcade 1986, the night of the Skywalkers. The gimmick was insane. A scaffold match. A narrow steel walkway erected 20 feet above the ring. No ropes, no nets. The winner had to throw the loser off the scaffold into the ring below. Hegstrand was terrified of heights. This is the irony of the monster. The man who projected absolute fearlessness was paralyzed by the idea of climbing that structure, but he couldn't show it. Hawk couldn't be afraid. So, he medicated. On the night of the match against the Midnight Express, Hegstrand was visibly altered. He climbed the scaffold with a grim determination. The match itself was a disaster, dangerous, awkward, and brief. Walking on a 2-foot-wide steel plank 20 feet in the air while wearing heavy boots and trying to fight is not wrestling. It's a death wish. When the match ended and they threw Jim Cornette off the scaffold, the crowd roared. They saw superheroes. They didn't see a terrified man high on painkillers clinging to a railing, praying he didn't die. This moment encapsulates the tragedy of the era. The fans demanded more danger. The promoters demanded more spectacle. And Mike Hegstrand, the human being, was the fuel being burned to keep the engine running. By the end of 1986, the Road Warriors were icons. They had won the inaugural Jim Crockett Sr. Memorial Cup, solidifying their status as the best team in the world. They were on the cover of every magazine. They had action figures. But the partnership between Hawk and Animal was evolving into a business arrangement. They were still brothers. They were living different lives. Animal was saving his money, investing, preparing for the future. Hegstrand was burning through his cash as fast as he earned it. He bought fast cars. He bought motorcycles. He surrounded himself with yes men and hangers-on who only wanted to party with the Road Warrior. He was lonely. There is a specific type of loneliness that comes from being famous. Everyone wants to know Hawk, but nobody asked about Mike. He began to resent the business. He resented the promoters who treated him like a circus animal. He resented the fans who demanded he be on all the time. If he was eating dinner at a Denny's at 3 a.m. and a fan approached him, he couldn't just be polite. He had to growl. He had to be Hawk. If he wasn't, they would say he was soft. The paint was no longer something he put on. It was something he couldn't take off. It had stained his skin. As 1987 approached, the cracks in the foundation were invisible to the audience, but they were widening. The physical toll of the Road Warrior pop, the massive shoulder block, the press slam, was destroying his back and neck. The chemical dependency was shifting from recreational to survival. He was the king of the wasteland, the master of the apocalypse, the toughest man in the world. But in the quiet moments of the night, staring at the ceiling of a cheap motel room in Nowhere, North Carolina, Mike Hegstrand was starting to realize that the road didn't have an end. It just went on and on and on, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could keep running. 1987 opened with violence. The Road Warriors were no longer just a tag team. They were a cultural phenomenon that Jim Crockett Promotions was desperate to monetize. The solution was War Games, the match beyond. For the fans, War Games was a spectacle. 2 rings, a double steel cage, a roof, and 10 men trying to maim each other. For Michael Hegstrand, it was a claustrophobic nightmare. The concept was simple: surrender or unconsciousness, no pinfalls. This environment suited the character of Hawk perfectly. It was lawless. But for the man, it was brutal. The low ceiling of the cage meant he couldn't stand on the turnbuckles. The steel mesh was unforgiving. In the summer of 1987, during the Great American Bash Tour, Hegstrand spent night after night trapped inside that steel box with the Four Horsemen. This period defined his physical decline. In a standard match, you can roll out of the ring to catch your breath. In war games, there is nowhere to go. You are trapped with Ric Flair, Arn Anderson, and Lex Luger. The air inside the cage was thick with sweat and heat. Hegstrand described it later as a meat grinder. He was 30 years old. His body was already sending warning signals. The gorilla press slam, his signature move where he lifted a 240-pound man over his head, was compressing his spine. Every night he did it, he was grinding his vertebrae into dust. But the roar of the crowd was the anesthetic. When he pressed Flair over his head, the stadium shook. He couldn't stop. He wouldn't stop. To cope, the chemical regimen intensified. It wasn't just about partying anymore. It was about maintenance. He needed uppers to get up for the cage and downers to sleep after the adrenaline crash. The cycle was becoming a noose. By late 1987, the NWA booker Dusty Rhodes had a problem. The Road Warriors were too popular. They were supposed to be heels, but the fans treated them like gods. In an attempt to turn the crowd against them, Rhodes booked a shocking angle. The setup. The Road Warriors would turn on Dusty Rhodes himself. They would attack him, and they would use a spike. It happened in November 1987. During a televised match, the Road Warriors assaulted Rhodes. Hawk took one of the spikes from his shoulder pad, a gimmick that had always been treated as a prop, and drove it into Dusty Rhodes' eye. It was a gruesome visual. Blood poured down Rhodes' face. It was one of the most violent images ever broadcast on wrestling television at the time. Hegstrand hated it. This is a crucial insight into his character. Hegstrand was a tough guy, yes. He was stiff in the ring, yes, but he wasn't sadistic. He respected Dusty. The idea of gouging a friend's eye, even as a work, made him uncomfortable. He felt it was cheap. He felt it was desperate. More importantly, it didn't work. The fans didn't boo Hawk. They cheered louder. They loved the violence. They loved that he had crossed the line. This confused Hegstrand. He was trying to be the bad guy, doing despicable things, and the audience was validating him. It fed his ego, but it also warped his moral compass. If he could stab a man in the eye and be cheered for it, what couldn't he do? The line between right and wrong was blurring. In the locker room, Hegstrand was becoming more erratic. He was the alpha dog, untouchable. If a promoter told him to do something he didn't like, he'd simply say no. "We don't do jobs," became the Road Warrior mantra. They refused to lose. It wasn't arrogance, it was brand protection. Hegstrand knew that Hawk was his only asset. If Hawk looked weak, Mike Hegstrand was starving. If there was one thing Mike Hegstrand hated more than losing, it was being copied. In 1988, the WWF created Demolition, a team that looked suspiciously like the Road Warriors. Then in the NWA, the promoters brought in the Powers of Pain, the Warlord, and the Barbarian. They were massive. They wore face paint. They were clearly designed to be the Road Warriors of the West. Hegstrand took this personally. He saw it as theft. He had built this persona from the ground up, the paint, the hair, the attitude. Now the office was trying to mass produce it. The feud with the Powers of Pain was stiff, legitimately stiff. When they met in the ring, they weren't working together, they were testing each other. Hegstrand wanted to prove a point. You can wear the paint, but you aren't me. In a series of bench press contests and weightlifting challenges aired on TV, the NWA tried to show the Powers of Pain were stronger. Hegstrand was furious. In the gym, he pushed himself to dangerous limits. to prove he was still the strongest. He was lifting weights that would tear a normal human's pectoral muscles. He was screaming at the iron. This insecurity fueled a new level of steroid abuse. He felt he had to be bigger than the warlord. He had to be more ripped than the barbarian. He was chasing a physique that was chemically impossible to maintain naturally. His mood swings became violent. One minute he was laughing, the next he was screaming at a waitress or a flight attendant. Animal tried to calm him down, but Hawk was unreachable. He was locked inside his own head, fighting a war against anyone who threatened his spot. Amidst the violence, there was a strange detour into business. In the late 80s, gym culture was exploding. Hawk and Animal, along with some partners in Minnesota, helped popularize a new kind of workout gear, Zubaz. These were the baggy, zebra-striped, neon-colored pants that became the unofficial uniform of the 90s bodybuilder. They were comfortable. They fit massive thighs that couldn't fit into Levi's. Hegstrand loved the Zubaz venture. For the first time, he felt like a businessman. He wasn't just a wrestler. He was an entrepreneur. He wore them everywhere. He gave them to other wrestlers. He was a walking billboard. For a brief moment, it gave him a sense of control. He talked about diversifying. He talked about life after wrestling. But it was an illusion. He didn't have the discipline to run a company. He was the face, not the brain. While the pants sold millions, Hegstrand was still living check to check, spending money as fast as it came in on cars, women, and drugs. The Zubaz era showed the tragedy of his potential. Mike Hegstrand was smart. He was charismatic. He could have been anything. But the addiction always took the wheel. The business meetings bored him. He wanted the rush. He wanted the party. By late 1988, the relationship between the Road Warriors and the NWA management had turned toxic. Jim Crockett Promotions was sold to Ted Turner, becoming WCW. The corporate suits took over. Turner executives didn't understand the Road Warriors. They saw liabilities. They saw two guys who refused to listen, refused to lose, and demanded immense salaries. They tried to split them up. They suggested Hawk go singles. Hegstrand refused. "We are a package," he said. "You don't buy the tires without the car." The breaking point was the schedule. The Turner era meant more dates, more TV tapings, more corporate appearances. Hegstrand was burnt out. His body was a wreck. His lower back was in constant spasms. He couldn't sleep without a handful of pills. He was drinking vodka for breakfast just to stop the shaking. In the ring, he was phoning it in. The matches became formulaic. The fire was gone. He was still Hawk. He still screamed. He still hit hard. But the eyes were dead. He was going through the motions. He started to resent the fans. They wanted him to be a monster, but he was just a tired, hurting man. He hated the airports. He hated the rental cars. He hated the sound of his own entrance music. In 1989, the unthinkable happened. The Road Warriors were no longer the biggest fish in the pond. The NWA WCW was bringing in new stars. The Steiners, Rick and Scott, were younger, hungrier, and better amateur wrestlers. They were the new tough guys. Hegstrand saw the writing on the wall. He saw that WCW was going to phase them out, or worse, make them lose to the new guard. His ego couldn't take it. He went to Animal. "We gotta go," he said. "We gotta get out of here." Animal was hesitant. The money was guaranteed. But Hawk was adamant. He needed a change. He needed a new high. He looked north to the World Wrestling Federation, to Vince McMahon. It was a gamble. The WWF was a cartoon land. It was the land of Hulk Hogan and gimmicks, but it was the biggest stage in the world. Hegstrand convinced himself that this was the solution. A new company, a new start. He told himself he would clean up his act in New York. He told himself that the change of scenery would fix the emptiness inside him. He was wrong. They left WCW in mid-1989 under a cloud of controversy. They were stripped of their titles. They were buried on TV. But Hegstrand didn't care. He was already looking forward to the next rush. He packed his bags, leaving the territory that made him a legend. He left behind the blood of the war games and the memories of the Omni in Atlanta. He was heading to the shiny plastic world of the WWF. He thought he was escaping the grind. In reality, he was walking directly into the belly of the beast. The 1980s were ending. The Road Warriors had conquered the world. But Mike Hegstrand was about to find out that the toughest opponent he would ever face wasn't Ric Flair or the Barbarian. It was the demons he was carrying in his own luggage. June 1990 marked the death of the Road Warriors and the birth of the Legion of Doom. The transition wasn't just a change of company, it was a migration to a different planet. Michael Hegstrand and Joe Laurinaitis walked out of the gritty, smoke-filled arenas of the NWA and stepped into the neon-lit, meticulously produced universe of the World Wrestling Federation. Vince McMahon didn't want the Road Warriors. He didn't own that name. He wanted his own version. He christened them the Legion of Doom, a nod to the Saturday morning cartoons that fit his company's demographic. For Hegstrand, the initial culture shock was violent. In the NWA, the inmates ran the asylum. If you were tough, you made the rules. In the WWF, everything was scripted, timed, and corporate. He was handed a schedule that mapped out his life in 15-minute increments. Interviews were no longer improvised screams into a lens. They were pre-written bullet points approved by writers. He hated the control. Hegstrand was a creature of instinct. He operated on feel. Being told what to say stripped away the raw danger that made Hawk special. But the money was undeniable. The merchandising machine of the WWF was printing cash. Action figures, lunchboxes, t-shirts, video games. Hegstrand saw his face on everything. It fed his ego, but it also commodified his identity. He wasn't a wrestler anymore. He was a product. The fans wanted one thing: the Road Warriors versus Demolition. Demolition had been the WWF's answer to the Road Warriors for years. They were big, painted, and wore leather. For years, barroom debates raged over who would win in a fight. Now they were in the same locker room. Hegstrand took this rivalry personally. This wasn't just business. It was about reclaiming his intellectual property. He looked at Bill Eadie and Barry Darsow, an old friend from the Minnesota bouncing days, and saw guys who had gotten rich renting his persona. When they finally met in the ring, the chemistry was clunky. Demolition was aging. Axe was hurt. The matches were sluggish brawls rather than the explosive wars the fans expected. Hegstrand was frustrated. He wanted to destroy them to prove that the originals were superior, but the WWF booking protected Demolition. They dragged the feud out. This frustration began to manifest in Hegstrand's behavior outside the ring. In the WWF, the party culture was different. It was more glamorous, more expensive, and more intense. The locker room was a shark tank of egos: Hulk Hogan, Ultimate Warrior, Randy Savage. Hegstrand felt the need to be the alpha in a room full of alphas. He turned up the volume on his lifestyle. The drinking became a daily ritual, starting on the plane and ending at sunrise. He was medicating the boredom of a corporate job that masqueraded as a gladiator sport. The apex of their WWF run came on August 26, 1991, Madison Square Garden, SummerSlam. They were booked to face the Nasty Boys for the WWF Tag Team Championship. The Nasty Boys, Brian Knobbs and Jerry Saggs, were brawlers from the streets, cut from the same cloth as Hawk and Animal. They were friends. They worked stiff. The match was a street fight. It was ugly, chaotic, and loud. When Hawk hit the Doomsday device, lifting Knobbs onto his shoulders for Animal to clothesline him off, the roof blew off the garden. Winning that title meant everything. and nothing. On paper, it was history. They became the only team to hold the AWA, NWA, and WWF world titles, the Triple Crown. They had conquered every mountain. They were undisputedly the greatest tag team of all time. But in the locker room afterward, the emptiness hit Hegstrand. He held the belt, looked at it, and realized his life hadn't changed. The pain in his back was still there. The emptiness in his chest was still there. The climb was over, and the view from the top was just another parking lot in another city. Without a chase, Hegstrand lost his motivation. He had beaten everyone. There was no one left to conquer. The rush began to fade, replaced by a dull, aching monotony. 1992 brought the beginning of the end. The WWF creative team, running out of ideas for two invincible monsters, decided to humanize them. They reintroduced Paul Ellering, but they also introduced something else, a ventriloquist dummy named Rocco. The idea was absurd. The story was that Rocco was the Legion of Doom's inspiration, a childhood toy they found in the wreckage of their old neighborhood. Vince McMahon thought it showed character depth. Hegstrand thought it was career suicide. Picture Michael Hegstrand, a 275-pound man who had spent 10 years building a reputation as a legitimate tough guy. He had bled in cages, broken bones, and terrified millions. Now, he was being told to stand on national television next to a wooden puppet wearing a leather jacket. He felt emasculated. He felt the company was laughing at him. Every time he had to interact with the dummy, a piece of hawk died. The fans were confused. The aura of invincibility shattered. You can't be terrified of a guy who plays with dolls. The Rocco angle broke his spirit. He stopped caring. His ring work became sloppy. He blew spots. He showed up late. The substance abuse went from maintenance to obliteration. He wasn't partying anymore. He was trying to erase the humiliation he felt every time he walked through the curtain. The final nail in the coffin was SummerSlam 1992. Wembley Stadium in London. 80,000 people. It should have been the highlight of his career. Instead, it was a public display of his disintegration. The Legion of Doom rode to the ring on motorbikes. It was a spectacular entrance. But if you watch the footage closely, you see a man who isn't all there. Hegstrand's eyes were glazed. His movements were a beat slow. He was visibly under the influence. He had arrived in London in a bad state. The flight over was a blur of pills and booze. He was exhausted, spiritually and physically. The roar of 80,000 people washed over him, but he couldn't feel it. He was numb. They won the match, but nobody celebrated. Animal knew something was wrong. The management knew something was wrong. Hegstrand was a liability. He was a ticking time bomb in face paint. After SummerSlam, the team returned to the States. The schedule didn't stop. The machine didn't stop, but Hegstrand did. In October 1992, at a TV taping, he looked around the arena. He saw the Rocco doll in the crate. He saw the writers with their scripts. He saw the endless line of fans waiting for autographs. He snapped. He didn't make a scene. He didn't scream. He just packed his bag. He looked at Animal, his partner, his brother, the man who had stood beside him for a decade, and said, "I can't do this anymore." Animal tried to talk him down. He talked about the contract, the money, the obligations, but Hegstrand wasn't listening. He was drowning. He knew that if he stayed one more day in the WWF, he would die. Either his heart would explode from the stress, or he would kill himself to stop the noise. He walked out the back door of the arena, got into a car, and drove away. He left the biggest wrestling company in the world. He left millions of dollars on the table. He left his partner high and dry. It was a selfish act. It was a desperate act. He flew to London, then to Germany, then simply disappeared for a while. He needed to find Michael Hegstrand again. He thought that quitting the WWF would solve his problems. He thought the addiction was tied to the job. He told himself that without the pressure of the TV cameras, without the humiliation of the puppet, he could get clean. He could be normal. He was wrong. The demons hadn't stayed in the locker room. They had packed their bags and traveled with him. He was now unemployed, rich, famous, and completely untethered. The structure of the road, as brutal as it was, had kept him functioning. Without it, he was free-falling into a void. The plastic empire of the WWF had chewed him up and spit him out, but the real darkness was just beginning. When Michael Hegstrand walked out of the WWF in late 1992, he didn't just leave a job, he severed his tether to reality. For 10 years, his life had been defined by a rigid structure: the booking sheet, the rental car, the arena, the hotel. He had a partner, Animal, who acted as his anchor. He had a manager, Paul Ellering, who acted as his compass. Now, he was alone. He was 35 years old. He was a millionaire. He was world famous, and he was completely adrift. The narrative of the rebel leaving the corporate machine sounds romantic, but the reality was grim. Hegstrand spent the first few months in a haze of resentment and chemical escape. He felt betrayed by the industry, by Vince McMahon, and by the caricature his character had become. He wanted to be a warrior again, not an entertainer. He looked east. Japan had always been a sanctuary for the road warriors. In the United States, wrestling was becoming sports entertainment, a soap opera with fighting. In Japan, it was puroresu, a legitimate combat sport, where fighting spirit and physical toughness were revered above all else. The Japanese fans didn't care about puppets or cartoon storylines. They wanted to see monsters. New Japan Pro Wrestling welcomed him with open arms. They treated him not as a disgraced employee, but as a returning, conquering hero. They offered him money that rivaled his WWF checks with a fraction of the schedule. He wouldn't have to wrestle 300 days a year. He would fly in for tours, 2 or 3 weeks of intense work, and then fly home. It seemed like the perfect solution. It was a chance to rehabilitate the Hawk brand. But there was a catch. He didn't have Animal. Animal had stayed behind to heal a severe back injury and ride out his WWF contract. Hawk needed a partner. NJPW paired him with a young, powerful Japanese wrestler named Kensuke Sasaki. Sasaki was a tank of a man, thick, explosive, and intense. He idolized the Road Warriors. He didn't just want to team with Hawk. He wanted to be Hawk. They repackaged Sasaki as Power Warrior. They painted his face. They spiked his pads. They called the team the Hellraisers. On paper, it was a cover band. It was a replica. But in the ring, the chemistry was frighteningly real. Sasaki brought a youthful fire that reignited Hegstrand. They weren't just doing the old spots, they were innovating. They created a finishing move called the double impact that was executed with brutal velocity. They dominated the tag team division. They won the IWGP Tag Team Championship. For Hegstrand, this was validation. It proved he didn't need the WWF machine. He didn't need Animal. He was the star. He was the Gaijin ace. The Japanese style, strong style, suited him perfectly. It was stiff. Contact was real. Lariats were thrown with full force to the neck. Kicks landed with a thud. Hegstrand loved it. It allowed him to unleash the aggression that had been stifled by American regulations. He could hit as hard as he wanted, and the Japanese wrestlers would thank him for it. It was a culture of honor through pain. But the tours were dangerous for a man with Hegstrand's proclivities. Life in Japan for a foreign wrestler is a strange existence. You are treated like a king, but you are isolated. You stay in nice hotels in Tokyo, but you can't speak the language. You can't turn on the TV and understand the news. You are trapped in a bubble. The post-match routine became a ritual of excess. The sponsors, wealthy businessmen, sometimes with Yakuza ties, wanted to wine and dine the famous road warrior. They took him to the hostess bars of Roppongi. They poured expensive whiskey. They handed him envelopes of cash for expenses. Without Animal there to act as the designated driver, and without Ellering to manage the finances, Hegstrand had no guardrails. The party in Japan was different. It wasn't the rowdy bar fights of Minnesota. It was a high-end, shadowy indulgence. He could disappear into the neon labyrinth of Tokyo for days. The drugs were harder to find than in the U.S., but alcohol was everywhere. Hegstrand began to drink with a terrifying efficiency. He drank to kill the boredom. He drank to kill the pain of the strong-style matches. He drank because, in the silence of a hotel room on the other side of the world, the voices of insecurity got loud. He was a god in the ring, but a ghost in the hotel. He missed his home. He missed the familiarity of the American road. He was making a fortune, but he was spending it just as fast on imports, international calls, and vices. When he wasn't in Japan, Hegstrand explored Europe. He began working for the Catch Wrestling Association in Germany and Austria, run by the legendary Otto Wanz. European wrestling was gritty. It was held in beer halls and tents, often over weeks-long tournaments. The crowds were rowdy and close. In December 1993, Hegstrand achieved something he had never done in the U.S. He won a major singles title. He defeated Rambo to become the CWA World Heavyweight Champion. This is a forgotten chapter in his history, but it matters. For a brief moment, Hawk stood alone at the top of a card. He wasn't one half of the Road Warriors. He was the champion. He defended the belt against legitimate tough guys. He proved he could carry a match, tell a story, and draw a crowd by himself. But the CWA wasn't the WWF. It wasn't WCW. It was a regional success. It didn't make the headlines in New York. To the American wrestling establishment, Hawk was missing. He was working in the wilderness. By 1995, the wrestling landscape in America was shifting again. WCW, fueled by Ted Turner's money, was buying up talent to challenge the WWF. They reached out to Hawk. He returned for sporadic appearances, and eventually a full reunion with Animal was brokered. In January 1996, the Road Warriors were back on American television. It should have been a triumph. The fans still loved them. The pop was huge, but something was off. The magic was diluted. The industry had evolved. The extreme style they had pioneered was now being done by everyone. Extreme championship wrestling was on the rise, featuring guys who hit harder and bled more than the Road Warriors ever did. More importantly, Hegstrand was different. The years in Japan and Europe had aged him. He was heavier, bloated from the alcohol. His skin had that leathery, sun-damaged look of a man who lived hard. His timing was a fraction of a second off, and the backstage politics of WCW were a nightmare. The company was run by Eric Bischoff, but the locker room was controlled by the New World Order clique: Hogan, Nash, Hall. The Road Warriors were seen as relics of the 80s. They weren't given the main event spots. They were used to put over the new cool guys. Hegstrand hated it. He hated being a legend. In wrestling, legend is often code for old. He wanted to be the ace. He wanted to be the danger. But the booking didn't support it, and his physical condition didn't support it. It was during this period, the mid-90s limbo, that the physical bill came due. Decades of heavy steroid use, combined with the somalizer cocktails and the constant trauma of the ring, began to manifest internally. He was suffering from heart arrhythmias. He had bouts of extreme fatigue, but the most visible scar was his liver. He contracted hepatitis C. It was a disease of the blood, likely picked up from a shared needle or a blade used for blading. It was a common plague in the wrestling industry of that era, a silent killer stalking the locker rooms. The Hep C diagnosis should have been a wake-up call. It required lifestyle changes. It required sobriety. But for Hegstrand, it was just another enemy to ignore. He treated his body like a rental car he was planning to crash anyway. He figured he was invincible. He was Hawk. He had survived the scaffolds, the cages, and the riots. A virus couldn't kill him, so he kept drinking. He drank to ignore the diagnosis. By late 1996, his run in WCW fizzled out due to contract disputes and lack of creative direction. He was back on the market. Then the phone rang. It was the WWF. The landscape had changed there too. The cartoon era was dead. We were on the cusp of the Attitude Era. Stone Cold Steve Austin was rising. The product was becoming edgier, dirtier, more violent. Vince McMahon needed stars who fit this new, gritty aesthetic. He wanted the Legion of Doom back. Hegstrand was hesitant. He remembered Rocco. He remembered the humiliation. But he also remembered the WrestleManias. He remembered the feeling of being the absolute center of the universe. And perhaps most importantly, he needed the money. The Japanese yen was great, but the travel was killing him. He wanted to be home. He and Animal agreed to return. They were promised a resurgence. They were promised that the WWF would treat them with respect as the godfathers of the new attitude. Hegstrand packed his bags for New York one more time. He looked in the mirror. The lines on his face were deeper. The eyes were weary. But he picked up the face paint. He picked up the red and the black. He began to draw the spider webs. He told himself this would be the victory lap. He told himself he would go back, win the titles, make $1 million, and then ride off into the sunset. He didn't know that he was walking into the most exploitative and psychologically damaging storyline of his entire life. He didn't know that the Attitude Era had no moral compass, and that his personal demons were about to become a plot point for Monday Night Raw. February 24th, 1997. Monday Night Raw, the Manhattan Center. When the opening riff of What a Rush hit the speakers, the reaction wasn't just noise, it was a physical force. The Legion of Doom was back. Michael Hegstrand and Joe Laurinaitis stormed the ring to destroy the Headbangers, and for a few fleeting minutes, time rewound. The fans in New York, the most cynical audience in the world, lost their minds. This was supposed to be the perfect marriage. The WWF had entered the Attitude Era, a period defined by anti-heroes, violence, and a rejection of the polished, cartoonish past. Who fit this mold better than the Road Warriors? They were the original anti-heroes. They were the architects of the very style that Stone Cold Steve Austin was now perfecting. Hegstrand felt the surge. He was 40 years old. His body was a roadmap of scar tissue. His liver was fighting a losing war against the hepatitis C virus. But that night, under the lights, he felt relevant again. The rush was back. He told himself that this run would be different. He told himself he would secure his legacy and his bank account, then retire in peace. He was wrong. The industry hadn't just caught up to the Road Warriors, it had evolved past them. The new cool wasn't just about being tough, it was about being meta, ironic, and nimble on the microphone. Groups like D-Generation X and the New Age Outlaws were changing the language of wrestling. They were sarcastic. They broke the fourth wall. In comparison, the Legion of Doom, screaming about death and destruction in face paint, started to feel archaic. They felt like a classic rock band trying to open for Nirvana. They were respected, yes, but they were seen as old school. In 1997, old school was a polite way of saying obsolete. By early 1998, the management sensed the staleness. Their solution was not to let Hawk and Animal be themselves, but to repackage them. They became LOD 2000. They were given a new manager, Sunny, a stunning, charismatic blonde, who was the it girl of the WWF. It was a mismatch. Sunny was glitz and glamour. LOD was blood and guts. Then came the helmets. The company spent thousands of dollars on futuristic chrome motorcycle helmets. They looked like props from a bad sci-fi movie. Hegstrand hated them. He couldn't see out of them. He felt ridiculous. He was a gladiator being dressed up like a toy soldier again. The frustration began to mount. Hegstrand looked across the ring at the New Age Outlaws, Road Dogg, and Billy Gunn. They were younger, faster, and the crowd was chanting along with their catchphrases. He realized he was losing his spot. And when Mike Hegstrand felt insecure, he didn't go to the gym. He went to the bottle. The creative direction of the WWF in the late 90s was led by Vince Russo. Russo's philosophy was crash TV. He believed that reality was more interesting than fiction. He wanted to take the real-life issues of the wrestlers and put them on screen. He called it shooting. Russo and the writers knew about Hegstrand's problem. It wasn't a secret. Hawk was showing up to arenas smelling of stale vodka. He was slurring his words in production meetings. He was nodding off in catering. In a sane world, an employer would send a man in this condition to rehab. They would protect their asset. But the WWF in 1998 was not a sane world. It was a war zone. Fighting for ratings against WCW, everything was fair game. They approached Hegstrand with a storyline. We want to do an angle where Hawk is struggling with addiction. Hegstrand was hesitant. It was too close to home. It was his darkest shame. But he was also a worker. He was from the old school where you did what the promoter asked. He was desperate to stay on TV. He wanted to prove he could act. And perhaps in a twisted way, he thought that by acting it out, he could control it. He agreed. It was the worst decision of his life. The storyline began subtly, then became a sledgehammer. Hegstrand had to act drunk on television. He had to stumble during his entrance. He had to miss tags. He had to look confused while animals screamed at him. For the fans who loved him, it was excruciating to watch. They weren't sure what they were seeing. Was it a show? Was it real? The low point came during a match where Hegstrand was scripted to pass out. He lay on the floor outside the ring, eyes rolled back, while the commentary team speculated on his condition. In another segment, he was scripted to vomit. Think about the psychology of this. Michael Hegstrand was an addict. He was fighting a daily battle against the urge to drink. And his job, the thing that gave him purpose, was now requiring him to pretend to be the thing he hated most about himself. The line between performance and reality dissolved. To prepare for the scenes where he had to act drunk, he often got drunk. It became a self-fulfilling prophecy. He was being paid to dismantle his own dignity on national television. To add insult to injury, the WWF introduced a third member to the team to replace the unreliable Hawk. His name was Darren Drozdoff, a former NFL player. They called him Puke. They renamed him Droz. The storyline was that Droz was the young, hungry lion coming to take the old lion's spot. Droz was actually a good guy, a friend to Hegstrand behind the scenes, but on camera, he was the enabler. The story morphed into Droz secretly slipping drugs or alcohol to Hawk to keep him messed up so he could steal his spot. Hegstrand felt the walls closing in. He looked at Animal, his partner of 15 years, and felt a deep sense of betrayal. Animal was going along with the storyline. Animal was the responsible one on TV, shaking his head at his pathetic partner. It drove a wedge between them. Animal was trying to keep his job, trying to keep the team alive, but Hegstrand saw it as treason. The brotherhood that had survived the freezing roads of Canada and the riots of Puerto Rico was breaking under the weight of a script. The crescendo of this exploitation occurred on November 16th, 1998. It remains one of the most controversial and tasteful segments in the history of professional wrestling. The setup: a despondent Hawk, pushed to the brink by his addiction and his replacement, climbs to the top of the Titantron, the massive jumbotron structure at the top of the entrance ramp. The implication was clear. Hawk was going to commit suicide. He stood atop the structure, swaying. Below, Animal and Paul Ellering pleaded with him to come down. Droz climbed up after him. The script called for Droz to try and save him, but in the struggle, to accidentally push him off. Hegstrand stood on that ledge, looking down at the concrete floor far below. A dummy was used for the actual fall, projected behind the screen to look like a body hitting the ground. When the segment aired, the arena went silent. It wasn't the heat the writers wanted. It was horror. Suicide is not a wrestling angle. Addiction is not a plot twist. Hegstrand climbed down from the structure, but the damage to his soul was total. He had allowed them to turn his pain into a cliffhanger. He had sold his darkness for a paycheck. When he watched it back, something inside him snapped. He realized that to the WWF, he wasn't a human being. He was just content. Hegstrand couldn't do it anymore. The shame was too heavy. The locker room felt like a courtroom where everyone was judging him. He confronted the office. He told them the storyline was killing him. But the machine didn't care. The ratings were good. So, for the third time in his major career, he walked away. He left the WWF in early 1999, but this time he didn't leave with his head held high like in 1992. He left as a punchline. He left as Drunk Hawk. The tragedy of this exit was that it severed his connection to the one thing that had always saved him, the respect of the fans. He felt he had let them down. He felt he had exposed his soft underbelly to the world, and the world had laughed. The year 2000 found Michael Hegstrand in the wilderness again. But the wilderness was colder this time. He was 43. The phone wasn't ringing as often. He tried to keep working. He took bookings on the independent circuit. He went to Australia for the disastrous I-Generation Superstars of Wrestling tour. This tour is infamous in wrestling circles. It was poorly organized and chaotic. Rodman down under. Hegstrand was there, hoping for a payday. But without the structure of a major company, he fell apart completely. There are stories from this tour that are difficult to recount. Hegstrand was showing up to the arena in no condition to perform. In the ring, he was a shadow. He was slow, bloated, and visibly suffering. In the locker room, young wrestlers who had grown up idolizing the Road Warriors looked at him with pity. That is the cruelest emotion for a man like Hawk. He could handle hatred, he could handle fear, but pity? Pity destroyed him. He was a gladiator without an arena. He was a warrior without a war. He was just a middle-aged man with a bad heart and a worse liver, sitting in a hotel room in Sydney, wondering where the rush had gone. The darkness had fully consumed the light. He was spiraling toward the bottom, and this time, there didn't seem to be a way back up. The year 2000 did not bring the futuristic apocalypse that the Road Warriors had always dressed for. It brought silence. And in that silence, Michael Hegstrand finally heard the sound of his own body screaming. He was 43 years old. In a normal profession, 43 is the prime of a career. In professional wrestling, especially for a man who wrestled the power style, it is geriatric. The human body is not designed to absorb the impact of a 300-pound frame hitting plywood and steel nightly for 20 years. It is not designed to filter a daily cocktail of painkillers, muscle relaxers, alcohol, and cocaine. Hegstrand was in Australia when the reality set in. The disastrous tour he had embarked on was falling apart, but his internal machinery was failing faster. He was suffering from shortness of breath, not the winded feeling of a workout, but a terrifying inability to pull oxygen into his lungs. His heart would flutter, beating out of rhythm like a trapped bird slamming against a cage. He visited a doctor, expecting a lecture about his lifestyle. He got a death sentence. The diagnosis was dilated cardiomyopathy. It is a condition where the heart muscle becomes enlarged, thick, and weak. It loses the ability to pump blood effectively. The doctor didn't mince words. He looked at Hegstrand, at the massive chest, the veins that still popped from his arms, and told him that his heart was operating at a fraction of its capacity. The years of anabolic steroids combined with the heavy cocaine use and the alcohol had ravaged the organ. He was told he had maybe a few years left, maybe less if he didn't stop everything. For the first time in his life, Mike Hegstrand was truly terrified. He wasn't afraid of a man in a cage or a riot in Puerto Rico. He was afraid of his own heart. The engine that had powered the road warrior, the engine that had fueled the rush, was broken beyond repair. Fear is a powerful motivator, but it rarely cures addiction on its own. Hegstrand returned to the United States a haunted man. He knew he was dying, but he didn't know how to live without the crutches he had used since he was a bouncer in Minneapolis. He watched his partner, Joe Laurinaitis, finding peace. The animal had always been the grounded one, but he too had suffered. Animals had found solace in Christianity. He wasn't pushing it on Mike, but the example was there. The animal was calm, the animal was happy, the animal was clean. In 2001, Hegstrand reached his breaking point. He was sick, he was tired, and the darkness that had followed him since the Titantron incident in 1998 was suffocating. He made a choice. It wasn't a PR move, it wasn't a wrestling angle. It was a desperate grasp for a lifeline. He became a born-again Christian. Cynics in the wrestling world rolled their eyes. The wrestler finding God trope is a cliché. It's often seen as a way to dodge accountability or a phase before the next relapse. But for Hegstrand, this was different. It was structural. Religion gave him what the gym used to give him, a routine, a set of rules, a community. For the first time, he admitted he was powerless. The ego of Hawk, the man who sold no pain, the man who laughed at danger, had to die so Mike could live. He stopped the drugs. He stopped drinking. For a man who had consumed enough vodka to float a battleship, the sudden sobriety was a shock to the system, but his damaged heart held on. The change in his demeanor was immediate. The crazy eyes softened. The rasp in his voice remained, but the manic aggression was replaced by a strange, quiet gratitude. He began to repair bridges he had burned with a flamethrower. He apologized to the animal. He apologized to his family. With his new faith came a new life. He met a woman named Dale. She wasn't a ring rat. She wasn't looking for the road warrior. She loved Michael. They married and settled in Indian Rocks Beach, Florida. This period from 2001 to 2003 was the happiest of his life. It is the tragedy of the story that the happy years are the shortest. He lived a domestic life he had never known. He mowed the lawn. He went to church. He took walks on the beach. He bought a condo. To the neighbors, he wasn't the guy who spiked dusty roads in the eye. He was just the big, nice guy who lived down the street and looked a bit like a retired linebacker. He still loved wrestling, but the obsession was gone. He worked the occasional independent show mostly to sign autographs and do quick, safe matches. He wasn't chasing the spotlight anymore. He was content to be a legend in semi-retirement. He and Animal were brothers again. The tension of the WWF years, the resentment over the Draws angle, the jealousy, it all evaporated. They spoke on the phone constantly. They talked about the future. They talked about writing a book. They talked about being old men together. But the wrestling business loves a goodbye. In May 2003, the WWE reached out. They were in Philadelphia for Monday Night Raw. They wanted the Road Warriors to make a surprise appearance. Hegstrand agreed. He was clean. He was clear-headed. He wanted to show the world that Drunk Hawk was dead. He wanted to show them the real Hawk one last time. The segment was set. They would face the World Tag Team Champions Rob Van Dam and Kane. When the music hit, that iconic guttural guitar riff, the reaction in Philadelphia was deafening. Philadelphia is a hard town. They remember everything. They remembered the wars. Hegstrand walked through the curtain. He wasn't stumbling. He wasn't bloated. He looked older. Yes, the lines on his face were deep trenches, but the fire was there. He stormed the ring. For a few minutes, he was 25 again. He hit the clothesline. He took the bumps. He fed off the energy of the crowd. When Kane chokeslammed him, he took the impact flat on his back. He didn't win the match. He did the job, as a professional should, but he won the night. He walked to the back, sweat pouring down his face paint, and smiled. He had done it. He had erased the memory of the Titantron. He had proven to Vince McMahon, to the fans, and to himself that he was still the Road Warrior. He didn't sign a contract. He didn't ask for a full-time return. He just packed his bag, shook hands, and went home to Dale. It was the perfect ending. The fall of 2003 was a time of transition. Mike and Dale were moving into a new condominium in Indian Rocks Beach. Moving is stressful for anyone. For a man with a heart operating at 20% capacity, it was dangerous. On October 18th, he spent the day moving boxes. He was lifting heavy furniture. He was exerting himself. He felt strong. He was happy about the new home. That evening, he felt tired. Not the usual fatigue, but a heavy, dragging exhaustion. He told Dale he wasn't feeling great. On the afternoon of October 19th, 2003, he told Dale he was going to lie down for a nap. He was tired from the move. He lay down on the bed. He never woke up. It was sudden. Massive heart attack. The damaged muscle simply stopped beating. There was no struggle, no pain. The most violent wrestler in history died in the quietest way possible. He died in his sleep, in his own home, a sober and married man. He was 46 years old. The shock of his death reverberated instantly. At his funeral, the toughest men in the industry, Ric Flair, the Minnesota Crew, and a devastated Animal, wept openly. They weren't mourning the superstar. They were mourning the friend who had finally found his way home, only to have the door close just as he stepped inside. Michael Hegstrand's legacy is undeniable. He and Animal didn't just participate in wrestling. They revolutionized it. They invented the cool heel, paved the way for the Attitude Era, and proved that charisma and raw power could eclipse technical perfection. Every wrestler who paints their face or screams into a microphone today is walking in Hawk's shadow. But the true victory of his life wasn't a belt or a sold-out stadium. It was his final chapter. He didn't die a tragedy of addiction. He died a man who had conquered his demons. In the end, the bravest thing the Road Warrior ever did was take off the paint, put down the bottle, and finally be himself. The rush eventually ended, but the peace he found in those final years was the only thing that was truly real.